Hey everyone, originally I was going to put up another song examination, but the song examination ended up being 5 minutes while the rest of the 15 minutes was just me discussing the topic as a whole. So we figured we just do a last video because I really don't want to be the worship song guy. I think the principles have been laid out about how I analyze songs and ideas of how you can better critically think through these songs. And I'm glad it's been helpful. And hopefully by now, those videos have kind of given you those tools to do that yourself, right? So we're going to be talking about three things today: music of heretics and worship, playing false teachers in worship, right? The basic principles of examination of songs, and then some personal, thoughts, reflections, whatever you want to call them. And now the first topic we've talked about over and over again, right? Leanne, Faithful Defender, on Instagram has talked about it. Katie, Brian Millennial has talked about it. Doreen Virtue has talked about it. Justin Peters has talked about it. We've had a debate on it, and I'll tell you how to get to that debate if you want to hear that for yourself. And we're going to briefly cover that just for the sake of having it somewhere, because I want this topic to be kind of moved on. It's not something that will be moved on in terms of like people who need the resource, so it was worth making the video. So that's what we're going to be talking about: a basic case against using their music, and then an examination of songs, and then personal reflections on the whole topic as a whole. So first off, the who matters, right? The song could get a B rating objectively by that standard I made, that chart. But if it's by someone who teaches a false gospel, it automatically gets an F. That's what it boils down to. There was a major discussion there behind the scenes kind of about, well, the song got a B because I was being objective about the words of the song, while the person behind the song negates the whole song entirely. So what we're going to cover here is the Bible and false teachers, very briefly, royalties, equal funding, leading others to false teachings, the theological backdrop, and then that there's better options. And so this is going to be really quick because I don't know that it really requires much time. So first off, everyone wants to use these other arguments, right? These other arguments, and they're all good arguments. We're going to cover them. But at the end of the day, the argument that matters is what Scripture says about false teachings. I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you have been taught. Avoid them. It's not play with them a little bit. It's not play their music. It's not use their Bible studies. It's not engage with their materials and share the materials in corporate worship. It's just not. The biblical principle of false teachers in the New Testament over and over again is to avoid them, look out for them, guard yourself from them. Jesus said a little leaven ruins the whole lump in regards to the Pharisees' doctrine. How should we view that in light of people who teach different gospels, such as the word of faith, prosperity? All those other arguments are great. They're great arguments and they make a great point. At the end of the day, it is obedience to the word that causes us to not want to play this music. We don't want to have the worship of Baal in our Christian service. We don't want the worship of the prosperity God in our worship. Avoid them. No exceptions. It's obedience. There's really nothing else to say there. So this one is a good question. Would you tithe to these groups? And I brought this up in the debate. Would you tithe to Joel Osteen? It sounds crazy, right? Because you would say no. Well, would you tithe to these groups that produce these music? You would say no as well. The problem is with every song that's selected by your church, you are tithing to them because the church is using the congregants' funds to pay for that music's royalties to play it and license it, because every song has to be paid for. Now you could say, well, that requires 25 cents. I'm actually not sure how expensive those songs are. Yeah, it still does use your money. Okay. But even if it didn't, what you see is that on the CCLI, they have what almost everyone has: top charts. And so if this song is going up the charts because your church keeps picking it, you are giving that song to other people who are looking for songs to play in worship. And it becomes kind of this branch where they go on the CCLI, hey, this song is popular, let's click it, let's play it for our church, and then they hear it, and it just goes up the ranks. So if you take out the money alone, you're promoting them by moving them up and recognizing and making them aware, showing that it's a song that's viable. It's approving it indirectly and directly. And it is also funding them in some shape or form, regardless of how much it costs. It's still the congregate's money that was supposed to go to the church that's being used to pay for these songs. I think the most dangerous part is the top charts more than the money because of that exposure. One church influences, let's say it's a really small church, has 50 people. Those 50 people will hear the song. They're all influenced by that song, okay? But then it goes up and another church hears it. Got a really sound church, 300 people. 300 people hear it. It gets seen again by another church that's big. Oh, this song is popular. It just goes on and on. So that's something we need to think about. It is promoting. It is helping. It is moving them up. Approval and directing. So again, by playing their music, you're saying that it's okay. Even if you explicitly state otherwise, right? You can explicitly say that Word of Faith and Prosperity is bad on the stage, but if you turn around and play their music, it's just a lack of integrity. It's contradicting yourself. And I think that's something worth saying. Those individuals that lead to them, if you play that music, you're doing confirmation bias. You're telling them that it's okay to play that music, especially for worship. And we'll get into that a little bit here in a minute, which we'll talk about, but regardless. It's a mistake that this will not lead them to sing their other materials. Talk about this quite frequently. I heard Bethel's No Longer Slaves for the first time in a congregation. I learned it on guitar. I played it live. I started listening to more of the music. Eventually, I started watching some of their Bethel TV videos, and then I started looking at their materials online through their website, reading articles, and I discerned that they were off. A lot of people don't. A lot of people start going to their conferences. I'll start people pulling in for the materials and subscribing to Bethel TV and all their other mediums. The people that hear the stuff they like want to find more of what they like. And so that's something to keep in mind. The theological backdrop is really simple. Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, even Muslims, they all have different versions of Jesus. Now, they may use some of the same terminology as us. They may even use the name Jesus. It doesn't mean it's the same Jesus. And that's something we need to recognize. So even if their song seems sound from the Orthodox perspective, whenever they use the same terminology as us, they don't mean that. Whenever they're talking about bringing heaven down, they mean it in a different way than we mean it. And that's something to consider. It's not the final argument, but it's a solid argument worth considering. So, options. There are other options. The excuse that there's not other options is inexcusable. And even if there weren't other options, you do have the Psalms and the hymns. And I'm not a Psalm or hymn only guy. I'm just not. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So if you had a quote from Joel Osteen and Charles Spurgeon that were identical, which one would you use? You would logically use the Charles Spurgeon quote. That's what I'm saying. Now, say that we have a bookshelf, or make it a music stand. We have a music stand from two musicians, say Sovereign Grace and Bethel. Say that all the songs are identical. Which one would you pull from? Sovereign Grace. Why are we going to the Bethel shelf at all? Same goes with books. You have Charles Spurgeon bookshelf, or you have a Rob Bell bookshelf. Say that they all have the same materials. Which one would you go to? You wouldn't go to the Rob Bell one. So why are we picking from that shelf? Is it worth the risk? Another option is guest pastors. Many would say right out the bat, no, we wouldn't have them guest as pastors. But you'll let them guest in your worship services. What's the difference? Proclaiming the word is worship. Singing praise is worship. They're both worship. Either way, you're using them for worship. That's what it boils down to there. This all comes down to obedience and holiness. It's like we like this song more than we care about what could possibly come from spreading this music. That's what it boils down to. This song feels good. It sounds good. If you put in the work, you'll find that there are other options. That's it. So things to consider. There is a distinction between corporate and personal conviction. It is my conviction that this is a Romans 14 issue outside of worship. If you can listen to these musicians in faith and not be harmed, and you're uplifted by them and all that good stuff, fine. In terms of what we use in corporate worship, it's not worth the risk of other people's lives being touched by it. It's not worth the risk of paying and supporting and endorsing. And of course, it's not worth the risk of bringing in false teachers to worship with us, because that's what we're doing. We're partnering in worship. We're having spiritual enterprise with them. We're bringing in the leaven. So there is a distinction between corporate and personal conviction. You can listen to this stuff on your own. That's fine. That's a Romans 14 issue. Corporate worship, I think it's unacceptable. That's my position on that. Does it make things harder? Yeah. We have to actually think through what songs we're picking and why we're picking them. We have to actually do our research and know where our sources are coming from. And that's hard. It's never going to be easy. It never is. So about songs. Who is the subject? What is the subject about? Is it about God or is it about us? And that's really what it boils down to. A lot of these modern songs are about us. And we'll talk about that here in a second. Who is it written to? Is it written to the congregation? Some of those songs that we discussed were written to unbelievers. It's unacceptable. We don't play that in worship because we're not unbelievers. Can it be, or is it corporate? Is it something where like the musicians are way off their rocker, singing way beyond the congregational ability? Or is it something where it's all about an individual, and so it's too individualized and there's no corporate aspect to it, whenever that's what corporate worship is? If you want to have an individualized song, go sing it in K-Love in your car. Don't sing it in corporate worship. That's the distinction. Again, what is this? What is the standard? We talked about there being theology in songs, and some people acted like I was saying there needs to be a dissertation in the song. No, our standard is so low that we haven't even gotten to a dissertation. We've gone to high school diploma. I'm not asking for Reformed Dogmatics 4 volumes to be in your songs. I think that we could hold people to a higher standard. One of the problems that everyone says is that there's biblical illiteracy and shallow theology. Our worship songs aren't helping. They're part of the problem. We need to bring people up to a higher level. They learn, they meditate, and they think through things whenever it's more of a challenge. That's just what it boils down to. I'm not asking for this big complex song. I'm asking for something of substance because a lot of these songs don't have any. So this is the chart we used. Anthropology. What does it say about man? Who is the subject? Theology proper. Are there attributes mentioned? Are there persons mentioned? Redemption. Christian exclusive is a big one. That's a big factor for me. Was it something that could be explicitly confessionally Christian, or is it something that a cult could sing? I think that's a big deal. Congregational and repetition and clarity. A lot of them are ambiguous, and I think that's just nonsense. I talked about the Lauren Diego song on a secular pop radio station. I think that's sad that songs that are being used in worship are that ambiguous. You wouldn't use a secular song in worship. Most wouldn't. So then there's 3 different categories. We have the first category of a song that is all about me with a little bit of God tacked on. I would say this is most of modern worship coming from these groups. That's what it is. It's me with a little bit of God. But then there is the songs that are God or me in light of God, which I think is more reflective of the Psalms and some of the good songs that we looked at, such as, yet not I, but Christ through me. It is about me, but in light of God. It's still about God, but it's not excluding the human experience. While this view elevates the human experience to where God is just kind of a sidebar. He's kind of just mentioned. And then, of course, there's the songs all about God, which you can't go wrong with. My view is that this is not for worship. Worship is not about you. It's just not. We can include human experience and human emotions. We just can. So I think that's important to remember. But God is primary. That's who we're there to worship. That's what worship is. We're not worshiping ourselves. To have the whole song about us is just nonsense. Before we get into just the random discussion, I did have a debate on this. Should we use Bethel, Hillsong, or Jesus Culture for worship? It's worth noting that the person who I was debating with changed their mind after this. So there's something to consider there. A lot of the same points will be heard, but you'll hear it in a debate format. You can get to it by searching debate on my website, christthecure.org. You can get it by going to False Teachers Bethel. It'll pop up, or you can just search Bethel. It'll pop up as well. Lots of ways to find it on the website, and I do have it where you can download it still, I believe. So approaches. This is important. We need to be approaching this with humility. Absolutely. I did it wrong. I corrected it. I was able to correct it. I was given that grace because my congregation is great. The reality is that we need to be sitting down, being delicate, having scripture, proving, making our case, and showing why it needs to be this way. If your congregation already recognizes that a lot of these groups are false or coming out of false churches, then it's a little bit easier. If they don't, then you're going to have some work to do. Set up a meeting, talk to them, make a case, ask them if you can send them materials, and then make a follow-up where you can have the materials discussed. Make sure there's several people in the meeting, right? Make sure that you talk to those who you can about it. That's all I have to say about that. So that's really kind of it for this section. Whenever it comes to my thoughts, I am not a hymns only guy. I think it's a little bit silly to say that, hymns are almost so pure that they're canonized. Again, we have Horatio Spafford's "It Is Well With My Soul." He was a cult leader, essentially. You can go debate about that all you want. It was my position that it's probably not the best whenever we're talking about corporate worship, if we're going to be consistent. You could say it's apples and oranges because Horatio Spafford isn't leading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to a false gospel. That's fair. He's also not getting money, except for those who actually covered, because those who cover the song get royalties, I believe. So that's an issue you can debate amongst yourselves. One thing I would say is that whenever we're handling this, there's a double spectrum of responsibility. If a woman is immodestly dressed, then that is on her for not being modest. However, you can't blame her entirely for the lust that's coming out of your heart. Jesus tells you to pluck out your eye and cut off your hand if it causes you to sin, correct? There's two spectrums of responsibility. Yes, she's responsible for dressing modestly so that the brothers don't stumble, and you are responsible for being diligent against sin. What I'm saying here is that whenever you go into a worship service, or however you handle the situation, you can do it improperly, and you can do it in error. You can be zealous for the truth and still sin. If you go in to worship and you don't have that in mind, you can worship in vain, or you can be doing, or your worship could be worse than those who are on stage. That's what it is. For me, my worship, whenever it comes to those songs being played in my congregation, or to just not sing them. That's how I honor God. That's how I worship whenever those songs come on. I care too much about God to sing these songs from these people who just butcher the Bible, who butcher the gospel. That's how I worship in the service. But you can go in there with bitterness. You can go in there with malice. You can go in there with disdain, hostility, and you could be committing just as much a sin, especially whenever some people haven't thought about this at all. So we need to be making sure that we're humble, that we're checking the speck in our eye before we come and do this. That's for sure. It's easy to get caught up in the passion of something whenever it clicks. Some people just don't see it as easily. In terms of the worship discussion in general, I have a lot of issues with it. And it's difficult for me because of that. And I love hearing the congregation sing. My personal view on worship, because I get asked all the time, is this. I would much prefer to hear the congregation over any musician on the stage. I would much prefer there be a curtain over the band on stage. I would much prefer there not be a stage. I used to play music live, and so my perception is from that experience. One of the reasons why I never joined a worship team, even though I play music, is because of that. Aside from the fact that I can't sing half the songs, and that goes into a whole other issue of the singing songs that the congregation can't sing. But it feels too much like a concert. And the career worship leaders, those who make a career out of it, that just for that, they're causing problems because that's not what it's about. It can be a career, sure. It's not a biblical office. The pastor is the worship leader. You can be helping with that, but I don't believe it's a valid office. I don't believe that there's warrant for saying that. And if you're in that position, if you call yourself a worship leader or a pastor, then you should have the qualifications of an elder, and which means that you should be diligent in checking songs against scripture. And that's the fact of the matter. Because you're putting words and praise into people's mouths. You're putting doctrine into people's mouths. You're teaching them through song. Singing is confession. And if they're confessing prosperity nonsense, that's on those who give them those songs. I'm not a hymns only guy. I think we need more sound Christian musicians and artists making more sound material. I think it's sad that we don't. But like I said, I would much rather there not be a stage at all, or the curtain closed on them. We don't need to hear drum solos. We don't need to hear guitar solos. We don't need to hear vocal ranges beyond what we can sing. We don't need to hear. We don't need to hear that. We need to be led in worship. We need to be focused more on where you're leading us to. That's God, than yourself. That is your purpose, is to point us to God. Your point is not to be on stage in that manner. I'm not saying the stage is bad. I'm saying that the way it can become is bad. If your worship causes anyone to be distracted by what you're doing on stage and distract from who we're supposed to be focusing on, you're doing it wrong. I would really like to see more solid musicians. I'm working on a list right now. People have been requesting a list for musicians, and I'm trying to vet them. So this is going to close out that discussion. It's a hard subject for me. At the end of it all, worship is the disposition of the heart. It's living out the Christian faith. The modern worship where it becomes a spectator sport reminds me too much of the medieval period where communion became a spectator sport, where only the priests could partake in communion. And the congregation just watched. That's what it feels like. And 9 times out of 10, every time I'm in a service, wherever it may be, I've noticed that the congregation sings louder and prouder to the solid hymns, probably because they know them more, granted, than the songs that require all the bells and whistles. We can talk about noise all you want, about volumes all you want, but if you can't hear the congregation singing, then it's not congregational, it's a concert. But worship is not about music. Music was minimal in the early church. It's primarily about the word and about the sacraments. And we need to remember that. If I could structure a church service myself, if I could design a church myself, you would come in, have 10 minutes of prayer, have 1, maybe 2 songs, a sermon, communion, baptisms, prayer, then fellowship, just hanging out, right? I don't think we need half of the worship service to be music. And I think it's that weird idea that music equals worship, but it's just not. And I have an article on that too called The Sacrifice of Worship, where we talk about that. But remember that living for God, transforming your mind is worship. And that includes this idea of recognizing true from false, recognizing that we don't want to partake in the music of those who are false teachers. And that's the question that always bugs me, is like, why would you want to play their songs? And sometimes I pushed people on it, and they'll just say, because I like it. And I've had one person admit that I like the music enough to disobey the commandment to not do with false teachers. He admitted that. That's really sad. So that's it. Wrapping up, I'm going to post it today. Get out of the way. In terms of IGTV for the summer, I am torn between 2 ideas. So if you have feedback on this, leave me a comment. I'm thinking about going through a book, or I'm thinking about running Q&As where I answer one question on IGTV on the off weeks. And so I put up the box, have multiple questions. I pick one, I make an IGTV video on it. Bam, done. On the off weeks that we don't have episodes. The walking through the book would also do that. We can do both. We can mix it. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. God bless you all and have a wonderful, wonderful day. I'll put these graphics up on the website sometime soon, but that's it.